Behind the dramatic narratives of raids and conquests that dominate popular understanding of the Viking Age, equally significant developments unfolded through Norse commercial activities that established unprecedented trade networks spanning half the known world. These commercial connections, linking Northern Europe with Islamic caliphates, Byzantine territories, and eventually North American shores, revealed Norse society as sophisticated mercantile civilization rather than merely skilled raiders. Understanding this vast trade empire demonstrates how Vikings transformed Northern European economic geography while creating commercial systems whose influence long outlasted their political dominance. The scale of Norse commercial networks exceeded anything previously established in Northern Europe, with archaeological evidence revealing trade connections stretching from Baghdad to Newfoundland. This extraordinary geographic reach resulted not from centralized planning, but organic development as Norse merchants progressively extended operations into new territories, establishing commercial relationships with diverse cultures, despite linguistic, religious, and political differences. The resulting trade system featured remarkable complexity, goods from distant territories passing through multiple hands before reaching final destinations, specialized mercantile communities developing at strategic junctions, and sophisticated value assessment systems facilitating exchanges between regions lacking shared currency. This commercial achievement represented organizational sophistication, comparable to Vikings' more celebrated maritime and military innovations, creating economic value through exchange systems transcending political boundaries. Luxury goods flowing northward through these networks transformed Scandinavian material culture, while revealing sophisticated consumer demand among Norse elites. Silk from Byzantine and Islamic territories appeared in high-status Norse graves, having traveled thousands of miles through complex exchange networks before adorning Scandinavian nobles. Spices from distant eastern territories changed Norse culinary practices among those wealthy enough to access these exotic flavors. Silver from Islamic lands provided raw material for distinctive Norse jewelry, combining foreign materials with indigenous design traditions. Glass vessels and beads, particularly from Rhenish manufacturing centers, brought previously unavailable aesthetic and functional properties to northern households. These luxury imports demonstrate Norse participation in sophisticated international exchange systems rather than merely extractive raiding economies, with deliberate consumer choices reflecting aesthetic discrimination and status competition through exotic goods rather than indiscriminate acquisition. Export commodities flowing outward from Norse territories created reciprocal exchanges balancing luxury imports with distinctive northern products valued in distant markets. Fur represented particularly significant export, with Arctic and subarctic species like sable, marten, fox, and beaver commanding premium prices in southern markets where these species were unavailable. Amber from Baltic shores, prized for both decorative and medicinal purposes throughout Mediterranean world, passed through Norse commercial networks, generating substantial profits for merchants controlling this distinctive northern resource. Walrus ivory served as alternative to increasingly scarce elephant ivory, its distinctive properties suitable for carving into luxury items for elite consumers throughout Europe and beyond. Most controversially, slaves captured during raids or purchased from intermediaries flowed through Norse commercial systems, with Dublin and other centres developing as significant slave markets, supplying human labour to both European and Islamic territories. These export products generated wealth flowing back to Scandinavian homelands, financing both further commercial expansion and Norse societal development. The silver economy, based on weight rather than coinage, demonstrated Norse pragmatic adaptation to commercial environments lacking standardized currency systems. Rather than requiring minted coins with recognized political authority, Norse merchants utilized silver by weight as standard value medium, with small scales among standard merchant equipment for precisely measuring precious metal regardless of form. Silver arm rings served dual purpose as both portable wealth and wearable status symbols, their standardized weights facilitating easy conversion to payment when necessary. Hack silver, precious metal items deliberately cut into smaller pieces, allowed precise payment amounts while revealing transaction-based approach to silver rather than merely aesthetic appreciation. This weight-based system enabled commerce across political boundaries, where no single currency held recognition, creating flexible commercial medium, adapting to diverse trading environments from Russian river systems to Atlantic coastal regions. Archaeological evidence from numerous silver hoards reveals this weight-based economy's geographic extent, with Islamic coins, Anglo-Saxon pieces, and other silver forms discovered together based on metal content rather than political origin. Archaeological evidence from hoards discovered throughout Norse territories and beyond reveals both the geographic scope and material diversity of this trade empire. The Cuerdal hoard, discovered in England, contained over 8,500 items, including coins from multiple political authorities, alongside hack silver and complete silver objects, demonstrating wealth accumulation through diverse commercial sources. The Vale of York hoard similarly combined items from territories spanning thousands of miles, from Afghanistan to Ireland, all gathered through trade networks before burial in northern England. Smaller hoards discovered throughout Scandinavia, Baltic regions, Russia, British Isles, and Iceland demonstrate similar international diversity, their contents providing tangible evidence of commercial connections spanning continents. These archaeological discoveries provide irrefutable material proof of Norse commercial sophistication, preserving physical evidence of economic connections, otherwise known primarily through written sources potentially subject to exaggeration or misinterpretation. The remarkable Eastern dimension of Norse commercial activity, often overshadowed in popular accounts by Western raiding and exploration, established revolutionary trade routes connecting Scandinavia with Byzantine and Islamic civilizations through Russian river systems. This Eastern enterprise, conducted primarily by Swedish Vikings, known as Rus, created commercial networks, urban centers, and eventually political entities whose influence continues shaping Eastern European development into modern era. Understanding this Eastern trade expansion reveals Vikings' extraordinary commercial adaptability while demonstrating how their economic activities established foundations for subsequent political developments whose consequences extended far beyond Viking Age itself. The Volga trade route connected northern territories with Caspian Sea regions through sophisticated river portage system, requiring intimate knowledge of complex waterways and substantial organizational capability. This route followed Volga River from its upper reaches near Lake Ladoga, southward, through forested regions into steppe territories, before reaching Caspian Sea, providing access to wealthy Islamic markets in Khazar territory and beyond. The journey required navigating diverse environments, dense forests, open steppes, seasonal flooding zones, while managing relationships with various peoples controlling territories along route. Archaeological evidence, including numerous coin hoards featuring Islamic silver, demonstrates substantial wealth flowing northward through this commercial artery. Contemporary Arabic sources describe Norse merchants operating along this route, providing external perspective, confirming archaeological indications of this Eastern commercial system's significance and sophistication. Rus Vikings established relationships with Slavic peoples, that evolved from initial commercial interactions toward complex political arrangements, combining Scandinavian and Slavic elements into distinctive political synthesis. Originally establishing trading posts at strategic locations along river systems, Norse merchants gradually developed more permanent presence through combination of settlement, intermarriage, and political agreement with local populations. Rather than merely imposed dominance, these arrangements typically involved negotiated relationships, benefiting both Scandinavian merchants seeking access to valuable resources and local populations gaining protection, commercial opportunities, and political organization. Arabic writer Ibn Fadlan's famous account describing Rus traders along Volga provides particularly valuable contemporary description of these Norse Eastern operations, detailing their appearance, behaviors, and commercial activities from external perspective, free from later nationalist interpretations, emphasizing either foreign domination or indigenous development exclusively. The foundation of Kyiv and Novgorod as trading centers represented culmination of this eastern commercial expansion, establishing urban settlements that would eventually develop into political centers dominating vast territories. According to later chronicles and archaeological evidence, Norse leaders, including legendary Rurik, established control over these strategic locations in mid-9th century, recognizing their commercial potential, controlling key points along river systems connecting Baltic with Black Sea. While nationalist historiography long debated the Norman question regarding Scandinavian role in these foundations, archaeological evidence clearly demonstrates Norse presence and influence during formative period, though with significant Slavic participation rather than exclusively Scandinavian development. These urban centers provided crucial commercial functions: secure marketplaces, storage facilities, craft production, administrative services, while simultaneously serving as political centers from which territorial control gradually expanded. Their establishment demonstrated Norse capacity for creating commercial infrastructure beyond merely exploiting existing systems, leaving lasting urban legacy still visible in Eastern European landscape. Byzantine connections and the elite Varangian Guard created prestigious linkages between Norse world and sophisticated Eastern Mediterranean civilization centered on Constantinople. Commercial relationships developed first, with Norse merchants bringing northern goods, furs, amber, slaves, honey, wax, to Byzantine markets while returning with silks, spices, glass, and other luxury products. These commercial connections evolved into political relationship when Byzantine emperors recognized military potential in Norse warriors, recruiting them as personal bodyguards forming elite Varangian unit. Service in this prestigious force offered Norse individuals unparalleled opportunity for wealth accumulation through imperial salary while experiencing sophisticated urban civilization dramatically different from Scandinavia. Archaeological and documentary evidence confirms substantial Norse presence in Constantinople, with runic inscriptions carved into Hagia Sophia's marble gallery, providing tangible evidence of Scandinavian visitors within Byzantium's greatest architectural achievement. This Byzantine connection represented Norse commercial and cultural reach, extending to Mediterranean world's most sophisticated civilization, demonstrating their integration into international systems far beyond Northern European peripheral status, suggested by earlier historical periods. Arabic accounts of Rus traders provide invaluable outside perspective on Norse commercial operations throughout Eastern territories, offering contemporary descriptions free from later nationalistic interpretations that often distorted understanding of these interactions. Writers, including Ibn Fadlan, Ibn Rusta, and others described Norse physical appearance, commercial practices, religious observations, and social customs witnessed firsthand, rather than through retrospective historical construction. These accounts contain ethnographic details impossible to invent without direct observation, specific funeral practices, commercial procedures, hygiene habits, lending credibility to their broader descriptions of Norse Eastern activities, while sometimes containing negative judgments reflecting cultural differences and religious disapproval. These Arabic sources, nevertheless, provide crucial evidence confirming substantial, organized Norse commercial presence throughout Eastern territories during Viking Age. Their survival offers historical window into Norse Eastern operations, otherwise known primarily through archaeological evidence lacking specific behavioral details these written accounts preserve. The commercial activities, extending outward from Scandinavia, stimulated unprecedented urban development within Norse homelands and territories under their influence. Trading centers emerged at strategic locations throughout Northern Europe, creating specialized communities focused on commercial exchange, craft production, and administrative functions beyond traditional agricultural settlements. These mercantile centers represented revolutionary development in Scandinavian context, establishing urban tradition previously minimal in northern regions, while creating economic infrastructure supporting broader Norse expansion through wealth generation, specialized production, and information exchange. Hedeby emerged as gateway between north and south, its strategic position near modern Danish-German border, creating natural exchange point between Scandinavian and continental commercial systems. Archaeological excavation reveals sophisticated urban development, planned streets, specialized craft quarters, defensive works, harbor facilities, demonstrating urban complexity comparable to more established towns elsewhere in Europe. Excavated materials show extraordinary diversity, with goods from throughout known world. Byzantine coins, Rhenish pottery, English metalwork, Arabic glass, all appearing within same settlement context. Contemporary accounts describe Hedeby as significant commercial center, where diverse merchants gathered for trade under regulations enforcing peaceful exchange despite participants' varied origins. This settlement represented far more than merely large village, establishing genuine urban functions, including specialized production, market regulation, administrative services, and international commercial exchange within Norse-controlled territory. Birka became Eastern trade hub, with exotic connections, its location on Lake Mälaren in central Sweden, providing ideal access point connecting Baltic trade with Scandinavian heartland. Archaeological investigation reveals settlement combining commercial functions with manufacturing activities, jewelry production, metalworking, textile creation, serving both local consumption and export markets. Grave goods from Birka's cemeteries demonstrate extraordinary international connections, with burial assemblages, including items from territories thousands of miles distant, arrived through complex exchange networks. The settlement's significance extended beyond merely commercial functions to include religious diplomacy, with Christian missionary Ansgar's 9th century visit representing early attempt bringing Christianity to Swedish territories. Birka's eventual decline coincided with Sweden's political centralization and shift toward agricultural focus in newly developed territories, demonstrating how commercial centers remained vulnerable to shifting political and economic conditions despite initial success. Kaupang served as Norway's window to the world, establishing Western Scandinavian connection to international trading systems through protected harbour on Oslo Fjord's western shore. Archaeological evidence reveals smaller but similarly specialized settlement focused on exchange functions rather than agricultural production, with clear evidence for seasonal occupation during peak trading periods rather than exclusively year-round habitation. Excavations demonstrate craft specialization, amber working, metalworking, textile production, alongside clear evidence for international exchange connections. The settlement's relatively modest size compared to Hedeby or Birka reflects Norway's more limited agricultural surplus and population base, while still demonstrating clear urban characteristics distinct from traditional rural settlements predominant in Norwegian territories. Kaupang's development illustrates how urban trading centers emerged even in less densely populated Norse regions, when geographic position offered commercial advantages worth exploiting through specialized settlement establishment. York, Jorvik, transformed into commercial center of Viking England following Norse conquest, demonstrating how Viking urban development extended beyond Scandinavian homelands to territories under their political control. Archaeological investigations reveal dramatic urban reorganization under Norse governance, with street layouts, property boundaries, and commercial facilities showing deliberate planning rather than merely continued occupation of existing structures. Craft production reached exceptional sophistication. Jewelry manufacturing, antler working, blacksmithing, textile creation, with clear evidence for specialized workshops rather than merely household production. Environmental evidence from archaeological contexts demonstrates commercial connections bringing exotic materials, silk, spices, fine wine, to York's markets from Mediterranean and beyond. The city's vibrant, multicultural character appears through diverse artifacts, reflecting both Anglo-Saxon and Norse traditions, alongside imported elements from Ireland, Frankish territories, and more distant regions. This transformation illustrates Norse capacity, not merely for destroying urban centers through raiding, but actively developing them when political control created opportunity for long-term commercial investment. Dublin controlled Irish sea trade, with expanding networks following its establishment as Norse settlement in 841 AD. Initially founded as Longfort, ship camp, combining raiding base with trading functions, the settlement gradually developed more permanent character with substantial urban features. Defensive earthworks, planned streets, specialized craft areas, harbour facilities. Archaeological evidence reveals Dublin's emergence as a significant manufacturing centre, with particular specialisation in fine metalworking, combining Norse and Irish artistic traditions into distinctive hybrid styles. The settlement served diverse commercial functions: slave trading early in its development, more diversified exchange in later periods, while maintaining maritime orientation, connecting Irish resources with broader Norse commercial networks. Dublin's development demonstrated Norse urban establishment capacity, even in territories without strong pre-existing urban tradition, creating commercial centre where none had previously existed, rather than merely occupying established settlement. The city's continued importance long after Viking political control ended demonstrates how these Norse commercial foundations created lasting urban legacy, outliving their initial political context. The Norse commercial expansion, described above, occurred not through specialized merchant class, entirely distinct from military activities, but through complex individuals combining trading capability with martial skills according to circumstances. This distinctive merchant warrior identity characterized Norse commercial actors, creating operational flexibility, allowing same individuals to engage in peaceful trade or forceful appropriation, depending on specific situations and opportunity assessments. Understanding this dual capacity reveals Viking commercial and military activities not as separate phenomena, but integrated aspects of single expansionary system. adapting various methods to different circumstances while pursuing fundamental goal of resource acquisition and wealth generation. Dual identity of Viking travelers as traders and raiders appeared throughout their operational territories, with same individuals capable of peaceful commerce or violent acquisition, depending on opportunity assessment and risk calculation. Archaeological evidence demonstrates this duality through trading ships containing weapons, merchant graves including military equipment, and raided sites showing commercial goods alongside conflict evidence. Contemporary accounts similarly describe Norse visitors sometimes trading peacefully and other times attacking, with choice between methods appearing pragmatically determined by target vulnerability and potential resistance, rather than rigid specialization in either activity exclusively. This behavioral flexibility created significant uncertainty for those encountering Norse vessels, as peaceful trading mission could rapidly transform into violent acquisition if circumstances favored such transition. The resulting operational adaptability gave Norse tremendous advantage over more specialized societies, where commercial and military functions remained strictly separated rather than integrated within same operational units. Trading in summer, raiding in autumn became recognizable pattern along many coastal regions, with Norse visitors conducting peaceful commerce during primary trading season before shifting toward raiding as autumn approached. This seasonal transition reflected pragmatic economic calculation rather than arbitrary behavior change. Summer months offered optimal conditions for legitimate trading, maximum available goods following harvest, favorable sailing conditions, numerous potential trading partners present at seasonal markets. As autumn approached and legitimate trading opportunities diminished following market season conclusion, the same Norse parties might shift toward raiding, targeting settlements already identified during trading operations, while utilizing information gathered through commercial interactions. This seasonal pattern appeared sufficiently predictable that some coastal communities developed corresponding defensive adjustments, welcoming Norse traders during peak commercial season, while preparing defenses as autumn approached, and behavioral shift appeared increasingly likely. Pragmatic approach to business across cultural boundaries characterized Norse commercial interactions, with remarkable capacity conducting mutually beneficial exchange despite linguistic, religious, and cultural differences potentially impeding communication. Archaeological and documentary evidence demonstrates Norse successfully trading with Celtic populations in British Isles, Slavic groups in Eastern Europe, Finnish peoples around Baltic, Frankish communities along European coast, and eventually indigenous North American populations during brief Vinland contact. This cross-cultural commercial capability represented significant achievement in medieval context, where religious differences often prevented peaceful interaction and linguistic barriers complicated commercial communication. Norse traders developed practical solutions addressing these challenges, simplified trade languages focusing on essential commercial vocabulary, standardized exchange practices transcending linguistic limitations, value demonstration through material comparison rather than abstract negotiation. These pragmatic methods enabled commercial success across extraordinary geographic range despite communication challenges that might have prevented less adaptable trading cultures from operating across such diverse contexts. Development of weight systems and proto-currency facilitated commerce through standardized value measurement, transcending political boundaries and local currency limitations. Rather than requiring officially sanctioned coinage like more politically integrated societies, Norse commercial systems utilized silver by weight as universal value standard, with merchants carrying small scales ensuring accurate measurement during transactions. Standardized weights found throughout Norse commercial territories demonstrate system consistency, with similar measurement units appearing across geographically dispersed sites, despite absence of centralized authority imposing standardization. Archaeological evidence reveals ingot molds, producing standard weight silver bars specifically designed for commercial transactions rather than decorative purposes. Certain arm ring types similarly show weight standardization, suggesting dual function as both wearable wealth display and potential payment method when needed. This weight-based system provided crucial commercial infrastructure, enabling exchange across politically fragmented territories where no single currency held universal recognition, demonstrating Norse pragmatic innovation, addressing practical challenge through material solution rather than requiring political integration beyond their developmental stage. Building wealth through commerce financed further expansion through reinvestment pattern, where successful trading operations generated capital supporting additional expeditions rather than merely funding consumption. Archaeological evidence demonstrates this commercial reinvestment through expanding scale of Norse trading operations throughout Viking Age, with modest early ventures progressively developing into substantial commercial enterprises requiring significant capital investment. Ship technology represents a particularly clear example, with progressive improvements developing vessels specifically designed for commercial applications, increased cargo capacity, specialized storage facilities, defensive capabilities protecting valuable cargoes. The mercantile vessel known as Nar represented culmination of this commercial shipbuilding tradition, with design optimized for trading operations rather than military functions, while requiring substantial initial investment beyond individual capacity in most cases. This reinvestment pattern created a virtuous cycle, where commercial success generated resources, enabling larger subsequent operations, which themselves produced greater returns, supporting further expansion. The resulting commercial growth demonstrates Norse understanding of capital accumulation principles and investment return concepts, despite lacking formal economic theory articulating these processes in abstract terms. While Norse commercial and military activities throughout Northern Europe, British Isles, and Eastern territories feature prominently in most Viking Age accounts, their Mediterranean operations receive less attention despite significant impact and extraordinary demonstration of Norse maritime capability. These southern expeditions, reaching territories previously considered safely beyond northern radar range, revealed Viking operational radius extending far beyond North Sea and Baltic regions into heartlands of ancient civilizations previously untouched by northern influences. Understanding these Mediterranean ventures completes our appreciation of Norse expansion's truly remarkable geographic scope, while demonstrating their adaptability operating in an entirely different maritime environment from their northern homeland waters. Raids on Spain and North Africa extended Viking reach into Islamic territories and Mediterranean basin beginning mid-9th century, with Norse fleets navigating through Strait of Gibraltar into previously secure southern waters. The most significant early Mediterranean raid occurred 844 AD, when substantial Norse fleet attacked Iberian coastal regions, sacking Lisbon, Cadiz, and Seville, before encountering serious resistance from Umayyad forces. Subsequent expeditions penetrated further, with documentary evidence describing Norse raids reaching Balearic Islands, coastal Morocco, and possibly deeper into Mediterranean basin. These operations demonstrated extraordinary navigational achievement, as Norse crews successfully transitioned from North Atlantic conditions to Mediterranean's different maritime environment. Altered wind patterns, reduced tidal variation, distinct current systems, requiring significant adaptation of sailing techniques developed for northern waters. The resulting operational flexibility revealed Norse as history's most adaptable mariners, capable of successful navigation across remarkably diverse maritime environments, rather than specialized for a single set of conditions, like many contemporaneous seafaring peoples. Service as mercenaries for various Mediterranean powers extended Norse military involvement beyond raiding into more formal arrangements, where northern warriors provided specialized military services to southern rulers. Byzantine emperors particularly favored Norse fighters, establishing famous Varangian Guard as elite unit, combining ceremonial functions with genuine military capability. Archaeological and documentary evidence confirms Norse military presence throughout Mediterranean territories, with runic inscriptions, distinctive weaponry, and contemporary accounts all testifying to northern warriors operating thousands of miles from Scandinavian homelands. These mercenary arrangements provided valuable service opportunities for Norse individuals seeking wealth through military skill, without necessarily commanding resources required for independent raiding operations. The resulting knowledge transfer brought Mediterranean military techniques, political structures, and cultural experiences back to northern territories when veterans returned home, creating information exchange, complementing material goods flowing through more conventional commercial networks. Cultural exchange with the Islamic world brought new influences to Norse society through both direct contact and indirect commercial connections. Archaeological evidence demonstrates Islamic material culture reaching Scandinavian territories. Coins, glass vessels, textile fragments, decorative items, providing physical proof for connections between these seemingly disparate civilizations. Arabic accounts describing Rus traders along Volga route offer invaluable external perspective on Norse behaviors, appearances, and commercial practices, providing contemporary documentation from sophisticated literate tradition. Norse artistic traditions show occasional Islamic influences, appearing in decorative motifs, metalworking techniques, and aesthetic approaches, though thoroughly adapted to indigenous stylistic frameworks, rather than merely copied without cultural translation. Even linguistic evidence suggests limited Arabic vocabulary entering Norse language through commercial interactions, particularly regarding trade goods, measurements, and specialized commercial terminology. These cultural connections between Norse and Islamic worlds demonstrate Viking Age as a period of significant cross-civilizational contact, rather than merely regional European development, with northern societies engaging diverse cultural traditions extending far beyond their immediate continental neighborhood. Lunar raid in Italy demonstrates extreme reach of Viking ships and remarkable audacity, characterizing Norse military operations, showers even at extraordinary distances from their homeland bases. According to contemporary accounts, Norse fleet attacked this northern Italian town in 860 AD after navigating entirety of Western Mediterranean, mistakenly believing they had reached Rome itself due to Luna's impressive stone buildings. This expedition reached furthest documented penetration of Norse military forces into Mediterranean basin, demonstrating operational radius extending thousands of miles from Scandinavian starting points through combination of exceptional navigational skill, shipbuilding technology capable of withstanding diverse maritime conditions, and logistical systems supporting extended operations beyond normal supply networks. While representing extreme example rather than routine operation, this raid nevertheless illustrates the truly extraordinary geographic scope Norse raiders could achieve when opportunity and ambition aligned with favorable conditions, reaching territories previously considered entirely secure from northern threats by virtue of simple geographic impossibility assumptions that Viking mariners systematically disproved through practical demonstration. Vikings in the Holy Land, as warriors, traders, and pilgrims, represented final frontier of Norse Mediterranean penetration, with documentary and archaeological evidence confirming Scandinavian presence in Christianity's most sacred territories. Byzantine military service brought Norse warriors to Eastern Mediterranean as Varangian Guard members, with contemporary accounts describing their participation in campaigns throughout region, including territories corresponding to modern Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. Commercial connections similarly extended into these regions, with archaeological evidence, including Norse items appearing in Levantine contexts, while Holy Land products reached Scandinavian territories through complex exchange networks. Following Scandinavian Christianization, pilgrimage created additional pathway, bringing northern visitors to Jerusalem and other sacred sites, with runic inscriptions recording these religious journeys. This Holy Land connection represented culmination of Norse Mediterranean involvement, with individuals from Europe's northern periphery directly experiencing ancient civilization's heartlands through combination of military service, commercial exchange, and religious devotion. The resulting cultural contact created information flow between regions previously separated by seemingly insurmountable distance, demonstrating Viking Age as period of unprecedented connectivity, linking formerly isolated European regions through Norse maritime capability, transcending previous geographic limitations. The Norse expansion that had revolutionized European security dynamics throughout the 9th century eventually stimulated significant defensive adaptations among affected societies. These counter-innovations, developing in military technology, defensive infrastructure, political organization, and maritime capability, gradually eroded initial Viking advantages while increasing operational costs associated with raiding activities. Understanding this European adaptation process reveals how societies initially devastated by Norse attacks eventually developed effective countermeasures that would contribute to Viking Age's conclusion as dramatically as internal changes within Scandinavian societies themselves. Military reforms specifically countering Viking tactics emerged throughout affected territories, as political authorities analyzed Norse operational patterns and developed targeted responses addressing previously successful methods. Shield wall infantry formations received particular attention, with training programs developing units capable of maintaining formation integrity against Norse shock attacks that had previously shattered less disciplined defensive arrangements. Weapons standardization improved, with communities organizing armories, ensuring defenders possessed appropriate equipment rather than merely improvised farm implements when raids occurred. Command structures similarly evolved, with clearer leadership hierarchies replacing ad hoc arrangements that had often collapsed under pressure during earlier Viking incursions. Signal systems developed coordinating defensive responses across wider territories, rather than leaving each settlement responding individually without mutual support. These systematic reforms transformed defensive capabilities from locally organized resistance easily overwhelmed by concentrated Norse forces toward increasingly professional arrangements capable of meeting raiders with equivalent discipline, equipment, and coordination, rather than merely numerical advantage insufficient against superior Norse organization. Castle building and urban fortifications changed landscape throughout threatened regions, creating defensive infrastructure specifically designed countering Viking operational methods. Early Norse success had partly relied upon target settlements lacking effective physical defenses, with wooden palisades or simple earthworks proving insufficient against determined assault. European societies responded through massive investment, creating stone fortifications resistant to burning, undermining, or simple physical assault. without specialized siege equipment raiders typically lacked. Urban defenses particularly evolved, with vulnerable commercial centers receiving substantial walls, controlled access points, and watchtowers providing early warning of approaching threats. Anglo-Saxon Burr system represented particularly systematic approach, with King Alfred establishing network of fortified settlements throughout his territories, providing both urban services and defensive infrastructure where local populations could shelter when raids threatened. These physical defenses dramatically increased costs associated with potential attacks, transforming previously vulnerable targets into hardened positions, requiring significantly greater investment to overcome than potential returns typically justified for raid-focused operations. Professional standing armies replaced feudal levies in more developed kingdoms, creating military forces specifically trained addressing Norse threats rather than temporarily mobilized civilians with limited martial skills. These professional units maintained continuous readiness rather than requiring mobilization period, during which raiders could complete operations before effective resistance materialized. Training programs developed techniques specifically countering Norse combat methods, with specialized drills addressing shield wall tactics, ship landing operations, and rapid deployment capability characterizing Viking attacks. Equipment standardization ensured these forces possessed appropriate weapons for anticipated threats, rather than varied individual armament characteristic of earlier levy arrangements. Perhaps most significantly, dedicated funding mechanisms developed supporting these standing forces through systematic taxation rather than ad hoc resource collection, creating sustainable military capability, persistent between specific threat incidents, rather than repeatedly assembling and dissolving according to immediate conditions. The resulting professional forces presented raiders with consistently available, specifically trained opposition, regardless of attack timing, rather than exploitable gaps between temporary mobilizations that earlier Norse operations had effectively targeted. Cavalry developed as counter to Viking infantry, with mounted forces providing mobility advantage against raiders who, though transported by ships, typically fought on foot once ashore. Horse-borne units could rapidly respond to reported landings, potentially intercepting raiding parties before they dispersed across countryside, where their small mobile groups had previously operated with relative impunity. The shock effect of cavalry charges proved particularly effective against Norse infantry formations, when terrain permitted proper deployment, with psychological impact often exceeding actual combat results through intimidation factor, against forces rarely encountering substantial mounted opposition in their homeland territories. These cavalry forces required significant investment, specialized breeding programs developing appropriate mounts, training facilities for both horses and riders, dedicated logistical systems maintaining operational readiness, demonstrating substantial resources. European societies committed specifically countering Viking threat. The resulting mounted capability presented raiders with engagement dynamics fundamentally different from earlier operations, requiring tactical adaptations while significantly increasing risk assessments associated with potential targets protected by rapidly deployable horse-borne response forces. Naval improvements challenged longship superiority through both defensive and offensive maritime innovations, addressing previous Norse dominance in riverine and coastal environments. Harbor chains, water-based barriers, and controlled access ports developed protecting previously vulnerable maritime approaches from surprise attack. Specialized defense vessels appeared at strategically important locations, their designs emphasizing combat effectiveness over raiding versatility that had previously given Norse ships decisive advantage. Signal systems along coastlines provided early warning when Viking fleets approached, allowing defensive preparations before raiders reached shore, rather than relying on accidental discovery. Most significantly, some European powers, including Wessex under Alfred, developed genuine naval forces capable actively contesting maritime space, rather than merely defending shore facilities, with specialized warships, trained crews, and naval tactics specifically countering longship operational methods, while never achieving Norse maritime capabilities' full range. These naval developments, nevertheless, significantly complicated Viking operations in previously uncontested waters, adding substantial risk calculations to expedition planning, while reducing potential target vulnerability through improved early warning and defensive response capability. Intelligence networks specifically monitoring Norse activities developed throughout affected territories, providing early warning of expedition preparations, even before fleets departed Scandinavian harbours. Commercial contacts between Viking homelands and European trading centres created information channels through which raid preparations became visible to potential targets despite attempted secrecy. Diplomatic relationships with Christianized Scandinavian leaders sometimes yielded intelligence regarding planned operations by their still pagan compatriots, creating division within Norse societies that undermined previously unified external operations. Specialized agents operated in Viking territories specifically gathering information on potential threats, their reports allowing defensive preparations before actual attacks materialized. Former Norse individuals who had settled within European territories occasionally provided cultural and tactical insights, helping defensive planners understand raiding operational patterns and potential countermeasures' effectiveness. These intelligence improvements transformed European defensive posture from reactive surprise victims toward increasingly proactive security systems, anticipating rather than merely responding to Norse initiatives, fundamentally altering operational dynamics that had previously given raiders decisive advantage through unpredictability and surprise, rather than merely superior numbers or equipment. Psychological adaptation perhaps proved equally important as physical defensive improvements, with European populations progressively developing mental resilience against terror tactics that had previously magnified Norse impact far beyond their actual numbers. Religious reframing helped this process, with Christian theology evolving from initial interpretation of raids as divine punishment, indicating spiritual failure toward understanding defense against pagans as spiritually meritorious activity, demonstrating religious commitment. Cultural normalization similarly reduced psychological impact, as generations growing up with potential raid threat developed coping mechanisms and practical responses, reducing panic reactions that had amplified damage during early Viking operations. Leadership messaging emphasized resistance rather than submission, creating expectation that communities would defend themselves rather than simply surrender when threatened, as had sometimes occurred during initial shocking encounters with previously unknown Norse tactics. These psychological adaptations progressively eroded terror advantage that had significantly magnified effective Norse power during expansion phase, requiring raiders to achieve objectives through actual physical capability, rather than leveraging psychological impact, multiplying their effective strength beyond numbers actually deployed. Diplomatic initiatives created alternative interaction frameworks beyond simple raid defense dynamic, characterizing earlier Norse-European relations. Trade agreements established mutually beneficial commercial relationships, providing Norse societies access to desired goods through peaceful exchange, rather than necessarily requiring forceful acquisition. Marriage alliances between European and Scandinavian noble families created kinship networks transcending previous boundaries, with resulting family connections complicating previously straightforward hostility patterns. Christian missionary efforts established religious commonality, gradually reducing cultural barriers that had earlier prevented meaningful communication beyond basic commercial interactions. Formal treaties recognized Norse political entities as legitimate participants in European diplomatic system rather than merely external threats requiring containment, creating framework where negotiation rather than merely military response became viable interaction method. These diplomatic developments provided alternative pathways, meeting Norse aspirations beyond simple raiding operations, creating possibility space where peaceful interaction could potentially deliver benefits comparable to successful raids without accompanying risks, increasingly prevalent as European defensive capabilities improved throughout period. By century's end, European societies had developed comprehensive adaptation packages, specifically addressing Norse operational methods that had previously proven devastatingly effective. The resulting defensive improvements, military, architectural, organizational, psychological, diplomatic, collectively transformed operational environment Vikings encountered compared to earlier expansion period, when European targets had lacked specific countermeasures against their innovative attack methods. While no single adaptation proved decisive, their cumulative effect substantially increased costs and risks associated with traditional raiding operations while simultaneously opening alternative interaction pathways through which Norse societies could achieve aspirations through means other than simple plunder. This European adaptation process represented significant factor contributing to Viking Age's eventual transformation, as external changes complemented internal Scandinavian developments, collectively shifting Norse societies toward different relationship patterns with their European neighbors than those characterizing explosive expansion phase that had previously reshaped Northern European landscape. The Norse religious transformation from indigenous polytheistic traditions toward Christianity represented revolutionary cultural reorientation, with profound implications extending far beyond merely theological considerations. This conversion process, occurring unevenly across Scandinavian societies during the 10th century, fundamentally altered Norse relationship with broader European civilization, while transforming internal social dynamics within northern societies themselves. Understanding this religious transformation reveals crucial dimension of Viking Age's conclusion, as spiritual reorientation complemented political, economic, and military developments collectively reshaping Norse societies during final pre-medieval transitional phase. Harald Bluetooth's strategic conversion during the 960s represented a watershed moment when Denmark's monarchy officially embraced Christianity, combining religious change with political consolidation through a calculated decision addressing both internal and external considerations. Archaeological and documentary evidence suggests Harald's conversion reflected pragmatic political calculation rather than exclusively spiritual conviction, as Christian adoption offered significant advantages, enhancing royal authority internally while facilitating diplomatic relationships externally. Baptism provided divine legitimization for centralized authority claims previously unavailable within traditional Norse religious frameworks, where kingship lacked specific spiritual sanction beyond generalized appeals to God's favor. Christian administrative structures, particularly literate church organization, offered governance resources supporting royal aspirations toward more centralized control than traditional Norse political arrangements had typically permitted. Externally, Christian identity removed religious barrier, previously complicating diplomatic relationships with continental powers, facilitating alliances, trade agreements, and political recognition previously limited by religious difference. Harald's calculated adoption represented sophisticated political strategy, utilizing religious transformation as tool advancing royal authority rather than merely personal spiritual journey. Establishing pattern, other Scandinavian rulers would subsequently follow with similar motivations, combining internal advantage with external opportunity. The Jelling Stone declares Denmark's religious transformation through monumental public statement, physically embodying this revolutionary cultural reorientation. This remarkable carved monument, still standing in Jelling, Denmark, features three distinct elements capturing transition moment. Runic inscription claiming Harald made the Danes Christian. Traditional Norse decorative elements showing continued cultural connection with indigenous artistic traditions, and Christian crucifixion imagery demonstrating new religious orientation. The stone's placement at significant royal site alongside large burial mounds and wooden church remains demonstrates deliberate creation of politically charged landscape, where traditional power symbols and new religious elements visually reinforced one another rather than appearing as contradictory statements. This physical embodiment of religious transformation, literally set in stone, public declaration of Denmark's new orientation, providing tangible evidence for conversion process beyond merely documentary claims potentially subject to exaggeration or misinterpretation. The monument's continued existence provides current observers direct visual connection with pivotal historical moment when Scandinavia's religious reorientation became explicitly articulated royal policy rather than merely individual spiritual choice, visibly demonstrating how religion, politics, and cultural identity intertwined during this transformative period. Missionary efforts gained foothold in Scandinavia through combination of external initiative and internal accommodation, creating an environment where religious transformation became increasingly viable despite initial resistance. Early missionaries, including Ansgar, had achieved limited success during the 9th century, establishing small Christian communities without transforming broader society. By 10th century, improved political conditions, including royal protection and growing commercial connections, created more favorable environment for missionary activities. Hamburg-Bremen Archbishopric particularly focused on Scandinavian conversion, sending trained clergy, religious materials, and institutional support, facilitating indigenous church development rather than merely individual conversion efforts. These external initiatives increasingly found receptive audience among Norse elites, recognizing political and commercial advantages accompanying Christian adoption, creating virtuous cycle where initial conversions facilitated subsequent expansion through demonstration effect and growing support infrastructure. While conversion narrative traditionally emphasized external missionary initiative, archaeological and documentary evidence suggests equally important internal receptivity, developing among Norse societies increasingly integrated with broader European systems, where Christianity represented standard religious framework for legitimate political participation and economic engagement. Olaf Tryggvason forced Norway's conversion through violence, demonstrating conversion process's darker dimension, where religious transformation sometimes occurred through coercion rather than merely peaceful persuasion. According to saga accounts, Olaf employed systematic campaign, requiring Norwegian coastal regions accept baptism while destroying pagan shrines and executing those maintaining traditional religious practices despite royal prohibition. Archaeological evidence confirms widespread destruction of pagan religious sites during this period, supporting literary accounts describing forceful rather than merely voluntary conversion process in Norwegian territories. This forceful conversion approach represented stark contrast with more gradual processes elsewhere in Scandinavia, reflecting specific Norwegian political circumstances where Olaf sought rapid consolidation, leveraging religious transformation as tool establishing royal authority throughout previously fragmented coastal regions. The resulting religious landscape featured nominal Christian identity imposed through royal authority, rather than necessarily reflecting genuine spiritual conviction among general population, creating situation where traditional practices often continued beneath superficial Christian veneer, despite official religious transformation. This coercive conversion methodology demonstrated how thoroughly religious identity had become entwined with political authority during Viking Age's final phase, with spiritual orientation no longer representing merely personal choice, but increasingly subject to royal regulation, enforced through physical violence when deemed necessary by ambitious rulers seeking rapid consolidation. Tension between old and new beliefs created cultural conflict as Norse societies navigated transitional period where traditional religious practices increasingly faced active suppression, while Christian alternatives remained incompletely integrated within Northern cultural frameworks. Archaeological evidence demonstrates this tension through burial practices, combining elements from both traditions. Christian crosses appearing alongside traditional grave goods, bodies oriented according to Christian practice while receiving traditional Norse funerary treatment. Documentary sources similarly describe hybrid religious behaviors, where individuals participated in Christian ceremonies while maintaining traditional practices, addressing practical concerns like harvest success or seafaring safety that new religion seemed inadequately equipped addressing from Norse perspective. This religious hybridity reflected genuine cultural conflict rather than merely cynical accommodation, as communities struggled reconciling deeply embedded traditional worldviews with revolutionary Christian cosmology, introducing entirely different understanding regarding human-divine relationships, ethical frameworks, and existential meaning. The resulting religious landscape featured complex negotiation between traditions rather than simple replacement, with Christian practices gradually gaining dominance through the centuries, generational change and institutional support, while traditional elements persisted through adaptive incorporation, rather than disappearing completely through simple prohibition. Religious roles of women diminished under Christian influence, representing significant social transformation, as female spiritual leadership positions available within traditional Norse religious framework disappeared within new Christian institutional structure. Archaeological and documentary evidence confirms women had served important religious functions within pagan Norse society, as vulva, seers, shamanic practitioners, priestesses at certain shrines, and specialists performing household rituals, maintaining family spiritual welfare. The incoming Christian religious structure offered no equivalent female leadership positions, with priesthood exclusively male, while women's religious participation became increasingly restricted toward passive reception rather than active leadership. This diminishment occurred alongside broader contraction of women's legal rights and social authority as Christian gender models, emphasizing greater patriarchal control, gradually replaced Norse traditions, allowing women significant autonomy in several domains. The religious dimension of this gender role transformation proved particularly significant, as female spiritual authority loss removed important avenue through which women had previously exercised public influence beyond domestic sphere. This gendered religious transformation demonstrated how conversion process affected Norse society beyond merely theological matters, reshaping fundamental social relationships and authority distributions through religious structures alterations. Conversion process occurred unevenly across Norse cultural sphere, with significant regional variations reflecting different political circumstances, external relationship patterns, and indigenous cultural factors. Iceland's conversion, famously decided through Althing vote around 1000 AD, represented unique approach where religious transformation occurred through community decision rather than royal decree, reflecting Iceland's distinctive political structure, lacking monarchical authority present elsewhere in Norse world. Greenland, similarly, experienced delayed and modified Christianization, reflecting its extreme isolation from European religious centers and limited ecclesiastical resources available, supporting full institutional establishment. These regional variations created diverse religious landscape across Norse cultural sphere, rather than uniform transformation process, with conversion timing, methodology, and completeness varying significantly between different territories despite shared cultural heritage. The resulting religious geography demonstrated how conversion process interacted with specific local conditions, producing diverse outcomes rather than standardized religious transformation. Despite general movement toward Christian orientation throughout Norse cultural world during this transitional period, practical advantages accompanying conversion likely proved equally important as spiritual considerations for many early Norse converts, particularly among elite classes whose political and commercial activities benefited significantly from religious reorientation. Christian identity removed significant barrier, previously complicating diplomatic relationships with European powers, facilitating political alliances otherwise difficult establishing across religious boundaries. Commercial opportunities similarly expanded, as Christian merchants gained improved access to European markets where religious difference had sometimes limited Norse traders' operations despite mutual economic interests. Legal protection when traveling through Christian territories improved, with converted Norse individuals receiving consideration as fellow Christians rather than potentially hostile pagans deserving suspicion. Educational opportunities expanded through access to church-controlled learning centers previously unavailable to Norse individuals lacking Christian identity. These practical benefits created powerful incentives for conversion beyond merely spiritual considerations, particularly among socially ambitious individuals seeking advantages within increasingly Christian-oriented Northern European environment, where traditional Norse religious identity increasingly represented liability rather than asset for those pursuing political or commercial advancement. Material culture transformation accompanied religious change, with Christian symbolic elements gradually appearing throughout Norse artistic production, reflecting spiritual reorientation's visual dimension. Jewelry designs evolved, with traditional Thor's hammers and Odin's symbols gradually replaced by crosses and other Christian motifs performing similar protective amulet functions while demonstrating different religious allegiance. Runestone carving incorporated Christian prayers and imagery alongside traditional commemorative functions, creating hybrid monuments where traditional Norse medium conveyed new religious content. Wood carving similarly evolved, with Christian scenes appearing in architectural elements and household items previously featuring pagan mythological imagery. This visual transformation physically embodied religious change throughout material environment, with everyday objects increasingly reinforcing Christian identity through constant visual reminders, replacing earlier pagan symbolic systems. The archaeological record preserves this material dimension of conversion process, providing tangible evidence, complementing documentary accounts while demonstrating how thoroughly religious transformation penetrated everyday life through objects people continuously encountered rather than remaining confined within purely ceremonial or institutional contexts. By centuries' end, Norse religious landscape had transformed fundamentally, though neither completely nor uniformly, across all territories and social classes. Official Christianization had occurred throughout most Scandinavian kingdoms, with royal authority actively supporting new religion while suppressing traditional practices through legal prohibition and occasionally direct force. Church institutional structures had established foundational presence throughout Norse territories, though with varying density and effectiveness, depending on specific regional circumstances. Traditional practices continued beneath official Christian surface, particularly regarding protective magic, agricultural rituals, and certain life transitions, where pagan customs retained perceived efficacy beyond Christian alternatives. The resulting religious environment represented revolutionary transformation compared to earlier pagan period, while simultaneously demonstrating incomplete transition still underway rather than fully accomplished conversion. This religious dimension represented crucial aspect of Viking Age's conclusion, as spiritual reorientation complemented political centralization, economic integration, and military developments, collectively transforming Norse societies from distinctive outsiders toward increasingly normalized participants within broader European medieval system, where Christianity constituted fundamental identity component rather than merely personal spiritual choice. Parallel to religious transformation, reshaping Norse spiritual landscape, equally significant political consolidation processes transformed Scandinavian governance structures from fragmented chieftaincy systems toward more centralized monarchical arrangements. This political evolution, occurring unevenly across different Norse territories during the 10th century, fundamentally altered power distribution, authority concepts, and governance methods throughout northern societies. Understanding this consolidation process reveals crucial dimension of Viking Age's conclusion, as political centralization complemented religious conversion, creating radically transformed Norse societies compared to fragmented pagan communities that had initiated expansion phase century earlier. Formation of unified kingdoms transformed Scandinavia's political landscape through intensive consolidation processes, reducing previously autonomous chieftaincies into subordinate positions within emerging monarchical systems. Archaeological and documentary evidence demonstrates this consolidation through changing settlement patterns, defensive structure distributions, tax collection evidence, and burial practices reflecting increasingly hierarchical political organization. Royal centers developed unprecedented scale and complexity, with settlements like Jelling, Denmark, Bora, Norway, and Uppsala, Sweden, featuring monumental architecture, specialized craft production, and administrative facilities supporting governance activities beyond local chieftaincy operations. This physical infrastructure embodied political transformation, visibly altering landscape through construction projects, demonstrating royal power, while facilitating governance functions necessary, maintaining expanded authority across previously fragmented territories. The resulting political geography featured fewer independent power centers, exercising greater authority across larger territories than earlier fragmented arrangements where numerous chieftains had maintained relative independence within smaller domains. Harald Fairhair's campaigns unite Norway through methodical military operations described in later saga accounts and partially confirmed through archaeological evidence. According to traditional narrative, Harald conducted systematic campaigns subjugating previously independent coastal regions through combination of military victory, political alliance, and strategic marriage arrangements, consolidating control over fragmented territories. While specific campaign details remain debated among historians, archaeological evidence confirms significant political consolidation during this period, with defensive structures, tax collection systems, and centralized authority markers appearing throughout Norwegian coastal regions previously lacking such unified governance elements. This Norwegian unification, though likely less complete than later saga accounts suggest, nevertheless represented significant political transformation from highly fragmented coastal chieftaincies toward more unified governance system, where royal authority increasingly superseded local independence despite continued regional autonomy in many practical matters. The resulting political structure laid foundation for subsequent Norwegian development as distinct kingdom rather than merely geographical term, describing physically connected but politically separate coastal territories lacking unified governance framework. Swedish unification under Yngling dynasty similarly transformed Eastern Scandinavian political landscape, though following different trajectory, reflecting specific regional circumstances. Archaeological evidence demonstrates emerging political centralization focused around Uppsala region, with royal burial grounds, religious centers, and administrative facilities, indicating increasing power concentration developed somewhat later than parallel processes in Denmark and Norway. Swedish unification faced distinctive challenges, including significant geographic barriers between regions, established provincial identities, particularly Götaland-Svealand division, an Eastern orientation, creating different external relationship patterns than Western Scandinavian territories, more directly engaged with British Isles and Frankish territories. These specific circumstances produced political consolidation, emphasizing negotiated relationships between strong regional powers and emerging central authority, rather than straightforward military subjugation characterizing consolidation elsewhere. The resulting political structure maintained stronger regional identity preservation within unified framework than Danish or Norwegian models, creating distinctive Swedish governance pattern where provincial law codes, regional assemblies, and local aristocracies maintained greater independent authority alongside gradually strengthening royal institutions. Centralization of power away from local chieftains occurred through multiple mechanisms beyond merely military conquest, with administrative innovations, strategic alliance building, and legitimacy enhancements collectively transforming governance throughout Norse territories. Administrative developments included standardized tax collection systems, royal representative networks extending central authority into provincial regions, and increasingly formalized legal procedures applying throughout enlarged territories rather than varying between local jurisdictions. Strategic marriage alliances converted potential rivals into stakeholders within new political order, binding powerful families to royal houses through kinship connections, while creating elite consensus, supporting centralized governance models. Legitimacy enhancements included religious sanction, particularly following Christianization, providing divine authorization unavailable within traditional Norse frameworks. Monumental construction projects visibly demonstrating royal power, and origin myths establishing ruling dynasties' special status through claimed connections with divine ancestry or legendary heroes. These diverse mechanisms collectively facilitated power centralization beyond what military capability alone could have accomplished, creating sustainable governance structures rather than merely temporary dominance quickly collapsing when coercive pressure temporarily diminished. Resistance to royal authority creates new waves of emigration as displaced elites sought territories beyond emerging kings' reach, where traditional independence might be maintained despite homeland developments. Iceland's settlement particularly reflected this political motivation, with significant early colonist contingent comprising chieftains and their followers, unwilling accepting subordination within Norway's increasingly centralized structure under Harald Fairhair. Similar processes contributed to Norse settlement in Orkney, Shetland, Faroes, and other North Atlantic territories, creating what some scholars characterize as chieftain archipelago, where traditional Norse political arrangements continued while homeland territories increasingly transformed toward monarchical systems. Some displaced elites preferred joining Viking expeditions to British Isles or continental territories, rather than accepting diminished status within emerging hierarchical structures, contributing experienced leadership to expansion activities driven partly by political displacement rather than merely economic opportunity seeking. This resistance-driven emigration demonstrated centralization's significant impact, reshaping Norse world not merely through direct governance transformation, but also through population redistribution, as disaffected elements removed themselves from emerging political order rather than accepting subordination within structures they found unacceptable compared to traditional independence they had previously enjoyed. Material culture increasingly reflected political centralization through prestige, goods distribution patterns, specialized production development, and symbolic communication systems demonstrating evolving political relationships. Archaeological evidence shows luxury items increasingly concentrated among emerging elite groups, affiliated with royal power centers, rather than more widely distributed pattern characteristic of earlier periods when numerous independent chieftains maintained relative status equality. Specialized craft production developed supporting royal courts with distinctive goods, fine metalwork, elaborate textiles, specialized weapons, physically embodying status differences through material culture, distinguishing social ranks more clearly than previous arrangements. Symbolic systems, including specialized jewelry types, restricted clothing elements, and particular architectural features, created visible status markers demonstrating political hierarchy through immediate visual impact rather than requiring detailed individual knowledge. These material dimensions of political consolidation literally embodied power relationships through physical objects, creating tangible expression of emerging social order immediately recognizable to contemporary Norse individuals through evolving material language of power, communicated through artifacts, architecture, and personal adornment. By century's end, Scandinavian political landscape had transformed fundamentally, though neither completely nor uniformly across all territories. Denmark achieved most thorough centralization under unified monarchy, utilizing Christian institutional support, enhancing royal governance capacity. Norway developed increasingly consolidated kingship, despite continued regional power centers maintaining significant autonomy within nominally unified structure. Sweden established dynastic rule while preserving substantial regional independence through negotiated relationships rather than complete subjugation. Iceland maintained distinctive governance without kingship, though developing increasingly formalized legal and administrative systems despite lacking conventional monarchical structures. These varied outcomes demonstrated how shared cultural framework could produce diverse political arrangements, responding to specific regional circumstances, rather than following single predetermined developmental trajectory. The resulting political geography featured increasingly formalized governance structures throughout Norse cultural sphere, despite significant regional variations, collectively transforming northern political landscape from predominantly chieftaincy-based systems toward increasingly monarchical arrangements more closely resembling broader European governance patterns developing during same period. Alongside religious transformation and political consolidation, reshaping Norse cultural world during Viking Age's final phase. Equally significant economic transitions altered material foundations supporting northern societies. These economic developments, involving changing raiding profitability, new taxation systems, evolving agricultural patterns, and shifting trade relationships, fundamentally transformed Norse material existence, while contributing significantly to Viking Age's conclusion as traditional activity patterns became increasingly unviable or unnecessary within changing circumstances. Understanding these economic transitions reveals crucial material dimension underlying broader cultural and political transformations characterizing period's final decades. Declining profitability of raiding as defenses improved created significant economic pressure, redirecting Norse energies toward alternative wealth generation methods, as traditional expansion activities yielded diminishing returns. The European defensive adaptations described earlier progressively increased operational costs associated with successful raids, requiring larger forces, more sophisticated equipment, and greater logistical support, while simultaneously reducing potential returns through improved early warning systems, allowing valuable item removal before raiders arrived. Archaeological evidence demonstrates this changing economic equation through declining new silver influx into Scandinavian economies during late 10th century, compared to earlier periods when raiding had generated substantial precious metal flows into northern territories. Contemporary documentary sources similarly describe increasing raid failure rate, with Norse forces more frequently repulsed without significant gains, or suffering losses outweighing acquired plunder. This fundamental economic shift undermined traditional raiding model that had partly fueled Norse expansion during previous century, necessitating alternative wealth generation approaches as formerly reliable acquisition method became increasingly unreliable within evolved defensive environment, where targets had specifically adapted, countering previously successful Norse operational methods. Growth of taxation systems funds royal ambitions through increasingly systematic resource extraction methods, replacing occasional plunder with regular revenue collection, supporting expanded governance activities. Archaeological and documentary evidence demonstrates developing tax collection infrastructure throughout Norse territories during the 10th century, with standardized assessment methods, physical collection points, and administrative personnel, representing revolutionary economic development within societies previously lacking such formal extraction systems. These taxation mechanisms provided crucial financial foundation, supporting political centralization processes described earlier. Funding royal retinues, administrative networks, construction projects, and other governance activities, requiring substantial resource commitments beyond traditional chieftaincy capabilities. The resulting economic transformation fundamentally altered relationship between rulers and population, creating institutional revenue generation methods replacing personal wealth derived from successful raiding that had previously supported elite activities. This systematic taxation approach represented significant step towards state formation processes, establishing self-sustaining governance funding mechanisms persisting regardless of individual rulers' personal wealth or military success, rather than remaining dependent on continuous external resource acquisition through expansion activities characterizing earlier Viking Age phases. Land pressure and continued emigration to colonies represented ongoing demographic dynamic, paralleling other economic transitions reshaping Norse societies during period. Archaeological evidence demonstrates agricultural intensification throughout Scandinavian territories. Field expansion, drainage projects, technological improvements, reflecting continuing population pressure against limited arable land availability, defining northern agricultural challenges. This pressure sustained emigration, flows toward colonial territories, including Iceland, Greenland, and established settlements throughout British Isles and continental regions, creating population transfer, redistributing Norse demographic resources beyond homeland territories. The resulting population movement patterns maintained expansion dynamic, established during earlier Viking Age, while increasingly emphasizing permanent settlement rather than temporary raiding, followed by return to Scandinavian homeland. This demographic dimension demonstrated significant continuity element within otherwise transformative period, as basic relationship between northern population growth and limited agricultural carrying capacity continued driving expansion despite substantial changes in specific methods, destinations, and organizational frameworks through which this expansion occurred compared to earlier raiding-focused phases. Climate beginning to cool again affects agriculture throughout Norse territories, creating additional economic pressure, particularly impacting marginal farming areas near cultivation's northern limits. Scientific evidence, including ice cores, pollen samples, and dendrochronology data, indicates gradual cooling trend beginning late 10th century, representing early stages of transition from medieval warm period toward eventually Little Ice Age conditions, reducing agricultural productivity throughout northern regions. Norse settlements particularly vulnerable to these climatic shifts included Greenland colonies and northern Norwegian territories, where shortened growing seasons and increased frequency of crop-damaging weather events created immediate subsistence challenges. This environmental pressure interacted with other economic factors reshaping Norse world, creating additional incentive, shifting toward economic activities less vulnerable to climate fluctuations than marginal agriculture attempting sustaining production in increasingly challenging conditions. The resulting economic adaptations included increased emphasis on fishing, pastoral activities rather than crop production, and trade relationships securing food supplies from more productive regions as insurance against local production failures, increasingly common under deteriorating climatic conditions. Economic shift from plunder to regulated trade represents fundamental transition, redirecting Norse commercial energies towards sustainable exchange systems rather than resource extraction through force. Archaeological evidence demonstrates this shift through trading center development, standardized weight systems, currency adoption, and specialized merchant vessel evolution, facilitating legitimate commerce rather than primarily raiding support. Contemporary documentary sources similarly describe increasing Norse participation in regulated European markets, with trading agreements, merchant colonies, and commercial partnerships replacing earlier patterns where trade often represented secondary activity alongside primary raiding operations. This economic reorientation reflected both push factors, declining raiding profitability, increased defensive capabilities, reducing successful plunder opportunities, and pull factors, growing European commercial networks offering legitimate wealth generation opportunities through peaceful exchange. The resulting commercial transformation redirected Norse maritime capabilities from primarily military applications toward trading operations, creating sustainable economic model that would outlast Viking Age itself. As northern merchants became integrated participants within European commercial systems, rather than primarily external disruptors extracting resources through force rather than exchange. Urban development accelerated throughout Norse territories during period, creating specialized economic centers facilitating commercial activities, craft production, and administrative functions beyond traditional rural settlement patterns. Archaeological evidence demonstrates significant urban growth in settlements, including Hedeby, Birka, Kaupang, Ribe, and Trondheim, with planned streets, specialized craft quarters, commercial facilities, and defensive structures indicating deliberate urban development rather than merely enlarged agricultural settlements. These urban centers provided critical economic infrastructure, supporting specialized production, market exchange, resource redistribution, and wealth concentration beyond capabilities within traditional rural frameworks. The urban environment created efficiency advantages through production concentration, knowledge exchange, resource pooling, and transportation cost reduction, improving overall economic performance while facilitating political centralization through administrative function concentration at urban centers typically aligned with royal authority. This urban growth represented revolutionary development within previously predominantly rural Norse societies, creating settlement pattern increasingly resembling broader European models, where towns played crucial economic roles, rather than remaining peripheral to fundamentally rural economic organization, characterizing earlier Viking Age phases. Craft specialization intensified throughout period, with archaeological evidence demonstrating increasingly sophisticated production organization, moving beyond household manufacturing toward workshop systems, creating higher quality, greater volume output. Specialized production facilities for metalworking, shipbuilding, textile manufacturing, and other critical industries appear in archaeological record. Their physical infrastructure, waste products, and tool assemblages indicating production scale beyond family-based manufacturing. Written sources similarly describe craft guilds' development, specialized training systems, and quality control mechanisms demonstrating production professionalization beyond earlier, more generalized approaches. This specialization improved production efficiency while enhancing product quality, creating economic advantages through improved resource utilization, while developing exportable craft traditions supporting broader commercial relationships. The specialization process contributed significantly to economic transformation by creating sustainable wealth generation methods based on manufacturing value addition rather than simple resource extraction, through raiding, developing economic capabilities that would remain valuable beyond Viking Age itself, as Norse craft traditions became recognized components within European production landscape, rather than remaining isolated phenomena within Northern cultural context. By century's end, Norse economic landscape had transformed fundamentally, though neither completely nor uniformly across all territories. Traditional raiding activity continued, but represented increasingly marginal economic component, rather than central wealth generation mechanism it had constituted during expansion phase. Taxation systems provided increasingly stable financial foundation, supporting governance structures throughout most Norse territories, though with varying sophistication and effectiveness, depending on specific regional political development. Urban centers flourished particularly in Danish and Swedish territories, while Norwegian and Atlantic settlement regions maintained more predominantly rural economic organization despite developing modest market centers. Agricultural challenges intensified through early climate deterioration effects, creating particular pressure on marginal territories, while intensifying southern Scandinavian development, where more favorable conditions permitted continued productivity despite emerging climatic challenges. These diverse economic developments collectively transformed Norse material existence from expansion-dependent system, characterized by external resource acquisition, toward more sustainable model based on internal production, regulated exchange, and systematic resource management, representing crucial foundation supporting Viking Age's conclusion, as northern societies increasingly resembled broader European patterns, rather than maintaining distinctive external raider identity that had defined earlier expansion phase. The final century of the Viking Age witnessed one last spectacular expansion, creating unprecedented political entity spanning multiple kingdoms under Norse leadership. Knut the Great, Danish prince, whose extraordinary career culminated in controlling vast North Sea Empire, including England, Denmark, and Norway, represented culmination of Viking political ambition, transformed from raiding expeditions toward legitimate state formation. Understanding Canut's remarkable achievement reveals Viking Age's final evolutionary phase, when Norse expansionary energy found expression through conventional political structures, rather than external raiding operations that had characterized earlier periods. Rise of Knut the Great as pan-Scandinavian leader began with traditional Viking expedition, transformed into permanent conquest through combination of military success and political legitimization. Son of Danish king Svein Forkbeard, who had conducted successful campaigns against England, Knut initially participated in conventional large-scale Viking expedition, following established patterns where substantial Norse force sought wealth extraction through threatened or actual violence. Unlike traditional raids, however, this operation evolved toward permanent territorial control through systematic conquest rather than merely resource acquisition, followed by withdrawal. After initial setbacks following his father's death, Canut secured control over England through combination of military pressure, strategic alliance building with English nobility segments, and formal legitimization processes, establishing his authority as proper king rather than merely successful raider. This transition from expedition leader toward recognized monarch demonstrated Viking expansion's final evolutionary stage, where Norse ambition sought permanent institutional authority rather than temporary dominance, facilitating resource extraction before returning homeward with acquired wealth. Conquest of England, 1016, through military brilliance, demonstrated Norse martial capabilities, reaching peak effectiveness, combining traditional Viking operational methods with increasingly sophisticated political understanding. Knut's campaign featured characteristic Viking elements, amphibious operations utilizing maritime mobility, strategic intelligence gathering, identifying political vulnerabilities, rapid force concentration at critical locations, while incorporating more conventional medieval military approaches, including pitched battles, systematic territorial control, and alliance building with indigenous power centers. The decisive Battle of Asundun showcased this hybrid warfare approach, with Norse forces employing traditional shield wall tactics while demonstrating discipline, organization, and leadership, transcending stereotypical raider operations toward more conventional military professionalism. Following military victory, Canut demonstrated equally impressive political acumen through calculated clemency toward defeated opponents, strategic marriage to Emma of Normandy, widow of previous English king, and careful power sharing with English nobility rather than attempting exclusively Norse dominance, creating inevitable resistance. This sophisticated approach combined Viking martial effectiveness with political wisdom, establishing sustainable governance rather than merely temporarily successful occupation, inevitably generating eventually successful resistance movement. Control of Denmark and parts of Norway creates First Empire linking Scandinavia with territories beyond, transforming traditional Viking expansion pattern toward conventional medieval state-building exercise. Unlike earlier Norse territorial acquisitions, CNUT'S multi-kingdom dominion featured systematic integration attempts, creating coherent governance structure, rather than merely personal union through single ruler. Administrative systems connected territories through appointed representatives, standardized legal frameworks, and deliberate governance integration, creating institutional connections beyond merely shared monarchy. Religious structures similarly facilitated integration, with church organization providing administrative framework, transcending traditional political boundaries, while offering ideological legitimization, supporting CNUT'S multi-territorial authority claims. Documentary evidence, particularly CNUT'S own letters and royal proclamations, demonstrates conscious imperial conception rather than merely accidental accumulation, with deliberate language, symbolic elements, and governance approaches, reflecting imperial ambition transcending traditional Norse political thought, focused on individual kingdoms, rather than integrated multi-territorial structures. The North Sea becomes a Viking lake, controlled and taxed through unprecedented naval dominance, allowing systematic resource extraction through regulated commerce rather than merely raiding operations. Archaeological and documentary evidence confirms substantial commercial expansion throughout CNUT'S territories, with trading centers, standardized weights and measures, and maritime infrastructure facilitating unprecedented exchange volume across North Sea region. Naval forces maintained security, reducing piracy, while enforcing taxation requirements on merchants utilizing these waters, creating revenue generation system through commerce regulation rather than plunder. This maritime control transformed traditional Viking relationship with North Sea, from raiders exploiting its transportation possibilities toward governance authority, regulating its usage through conventional state mechanisms. The resulting commercial environment provided substantial economic benefits throughout CNUT'S territories, while generating significant royal revenue, supporting governance activities, military operations, and prestige projects, demonstrating imperial status through visible wealth deployment in religious donations, construction projects, and court magnificence. Administrative innovations blend Anglo-Saxon and Norse systems, creating sophisticated governance structures, transcending earlier Viking political arrangements, while establishing foundation for subsequent medieval developments. Documentary evidence demonstrates deliberate synthesis rather than merely imposed Norse dominance, with CNUT maintaining many Anglo-Saxon governance elements while introducing Scandinavian concepts where advantageous within specific contexts. The resulting hybrid system featured carefully balanced personnel appointments integrating English and Norse officials, legal frameworks combining traditions from both cultures, and communication systems utilizing written administration inherited from Anglo-Saxon practice, alongside traditional Norse assembly-based methods. This administrative sophistication demonstrated extraordinary distance traveled from earlier Viking governance approaches, with state infrastructure complexity, bureaucratic specialization, and institutional permanence transcending traditional Norse arrangements, while establishing foundation supporting subsequent medieval governance evolution throughout North Sea region, regardless of CNUT'S empire's relatively brief existence as unified entity. CNUT'S religious patronage represented crucial legitimization strategy, transforming former pagan Viking leader into proper Christian monarch through calculated devotional displays, establishing appropriate medieval royal identity. Documentary and archaeological evidence confirms extraordinary generosity toward church institutions, cathedral endowments, monastery foundations, clergy support, creating religious infrastructure, demonstrating appropriate Christian kingship, while securing ecclesiastical support for imperial project. Pilgrimage to Rome provided particularly significant legitimization, with contemporary accounts describing CNUT'S elaborate journey, demonstrating both personal piety and political sophistication through diplomatic connections established during travel. Religious administrative appointments similarly reflected calculated strategy, balancing local traditions with imperial requirements, maintaining appropriate ecclesiastical support, while avoiding unnecessary opposition through overly aggressive centralization. This religious dimension transformed Norse leadership image from pagan raiders toward conventional Christian monarchy, integrating Scandinavian rulership within broader European political religious framework, where Christian identity represented fundamental legitimacy component rather than merely optional personal orientation. Economic integration throughout CNUT'S territories created unprecedented commercial zones spanning multiple kingdoms, with archaeological evidence demonstrating substantial trade increases throughout North Sea region during his reign. Standardized silver coinage issued throughout his territories facilitated commerce across previously fragmented monetary landscapes, with remarkable consistency in weight, purity, and design, demonstrating sophisticated economic understanding, supporting imperial project. Harbor infrastructure development, trading regulations, and market establishment created institutional framework supporting merchant activities throughout empire, generating both economic prosperity and taxation revenue, supporting governance activities. This commercial integration represented revolutionary development, transcending traditional Viking economic approaches through systematic institutional support, rather than merely individual entrepreneurial activities, operating within loosely organized frameworks. The resulting economic system contained elements outlasting CNUT'S personal rule, establishing commercial relationships and infrastructure, continuing despite imperial structure's eventual dissolution following his death. Diplomatic relationships with continental powers demonstrate CNUT'S extraordinary transition from Viking raider toward recognized European monarch through calculated alliance building, strategic marriages, and formal diplomatic exchanges. Contemporary sources describe CNUT'S participation in conventional royal activities, attending imperial coronation in Rome, exchanging formal diplomatic communications with various European rulers, negotiating territorial agreements through standard diplomatic channels, demonstrating complete transformation from outside raider toward inside participant within established medieval political system. Marriage arrangements for his children similarly reflect conventional royal strategy rather than Norse traditional approaches, with documented negotiations seeking advantageous connections with various European powers, supporting imperial ambitions through family network establishment, typical for medieval monarchy rather than earlier Viking leadership patterns. This diplomatic dimension completed CNUT'S astonishing personal and political transformation, creating royal identity indistinguishable from other legitimate European monarchs. Despite origin within Viking tradition, previously considered fundamentally outside legitimate political framework by establishment Christian powers. The empire's fragmentation following CNUT'S death in 1035 resulted from combination of succession difficulties, specific territorial challenges, and institutional limitations rather than fundamental conceptual failure. Documentary sources describe complex succession situation where multiple claimants advanced competing claims based on different legitimization principles, creating divided authority, undermining imperial unity CNUT had carefully maintained through personal presence and diplomatic skill. Regional challenges emerged particularly in Norway, where Magnus the Good successfully asserted independent kingship against Cnut's son, Harthacnut's imperial claims, fragmenting multi-kingdom structure through successful localized resistance. Institutional limitations similarly contributed to dissolution, as governance systems remained insufficiently integrated, sustaining unity without extraordinary personal capability Cnut had provided during establishment phase. Despite relatively brief existence as unified entity, Cnut's imperial project nevertheless demonstrated Viking political evolution's furthest extension, transforming Norse expansion from raiding operations toward legitimate state-building ambition, expressed through conventional medieval political forms, rather than traditionally distinctive Viking approaches characterized earlier expansion phases. Alongside political transformations, reshaping Norse power structures during Viking Age's final century, equally significant material culture changes reflected fundamental transitions occurring throughout northern societies. These material developments, affecting artistic styles, weapons technology, settlement patterns, economic systems, and built environment, visibly embodied broader cultural evolution, transforming Norse societies from distinctive outsiders toward increasingly normalized participants within European medieval civilization. Understanding these material changes reveals tangible dimensions of Viking Age's conclusion, as physical objects and environments people encountered daily reflected revolutionary transformations reshaping Norse world during this pivotal period. Christian art styles began replacing pagan motifs throughout Norse visual culture, creating material environment increasingly aligned with new religious orientation, rather than traditional spiritual framework that had previously informed northern aesthetic development. Archaeological evidence demonstrates this transition through changing decorative elements on everyday objects, jewelry incorporating cross imagery rather than Thor's hammers, domestic items featuring Christian symbols replacing earlier pagan references, textile patterns evolving toward designs lacking previous cosmological associations. Monumental expression similarly transformed, with runestones increasingly featuring Christian prayers, imagery, and symbolic elements alongside traditional commemorative functions. This visual transformation represented religious change's material dimension, creating physical environment constantly reinforcing new spiritual orientation through objects people encountered throughout daily activities, rather than religion remaining abstract concept encountered only during formal ceremonial occasions. The resulting material culture visibly demonstrated Norse society's revolutionary reorientation from indigenous religious tradition toward participation in broader European spiritual community, where Christian visual language provided shared symbolic system, transcending earlier, more fragmented religious expressions. Weapons evolved with changing warfare tactics, as Norse military activities increasingly resembled conventional medieval patterns, rather than distinctive raiding operations characterizing earlier Viking phases. Archaeological evidence reveals this evolution through changing weapon assemblages, increased emphasis on lance and shield combinations suited for cavalry operations, heavier armor appearing more frequently in high-status burial contexts, specialized weapons designed for formation fighting rather than individual combat. Contemporary artistic representations similarly show Norse warriors increasingly equipped similarly to other European fighters, rather than maintaining distinctive equipment sets, visibly identifying them as separate tradition. This material transition reflected broader military evolution as Norse forces increasingly participated in conventional medieval warfare, territorial control operations, pitched battles between formal armies, siege operations against fortified positions, rather than primarily coastal raiding activities emphasizing mobility, surprise, and temporary presence characterizing classic Viking operations. The resulting equipment convergence visibly demonstrated Norse integration within European military systems, rather than maintaining entirely distinctive operational approach, requiring specialized equipment differentiated from continental patterns. Urbanization changes settlement patterns throughout Norse territories. As growing towns, increasingly concentrated population, economic activities, and administrative functions within planned environments, rather than dispersed rural settlements characterizing earlier periods. Archaeological evidence demonstrates urban growth through systematic excavations, revealing increasingly complex street layouts, specialized craft quarters, commercial facilities, defensive structures, and administrative buildings, collectively indicating deliberate urban development rather than merely enlarged agricultural settlements. Contemporary documentary sources similarly describe towns serving diverse functions: commercial centers facilitating trade, administrative hubs supporting governance activities, religious focuses hosting ecclesiastical institutions, defensive positions protecting surrounding territories. This urban development represented revolutionary change within previously predominantly rural Norse societies, creating settlement pattern increasingly resembling broader European models, where towns played crucial economic, political, and cultural roles, rather than remaining peripheral to fundamentally rural social organization characterizing earlier Viking Age phases. The resulting built environment physically embodied Norse society's transformation, creating visibly different living spaces embodying new social relationships, economic patterns, and political structures emerging during this transitional period. Coinage replaces weight-based silver economy throughout most Norse territories, creating standardized monetary system, facilitating commerce, taxation, and wealth display through officially sanctioned currency rather than hack silver or other non-standardized exchange media. Archaeological evidence demonstrates this monetary evolution through coin hoards, showing increasing prevalence of official issues rather than miscellaneous silver fragments. Commercial sites yielding standardized denominations rather than weighing equipment, and elite contexts displaying coin-based wealth demonstration rather than silver arm rings or other traditional wealth forms. Documentary sources similarly reference monetary transactions using standardized units rather than weight-based calculations, indicating conceptual shift toward value understanding based on official designation rather than merely intrinsic metal content. This monetary transformation represented significant economic sophistication development, creating exchange medium facilitating complex commercial transactions, while simultaneously serving political purpose through imagery, physically linking currency to issuing authority, thereby reinforcing political legitimacy through everyday economic activities, utilizing official coinage bearing royal names, portraits, and symbols literally passing through subjects' hands during routine transactions. Monumental stone churches appear in Scandinavia, their construction representing revolutionary built environment transformation, physically embodying Christian institutional establishment throughout Norse territories. Archaeological evidence reveals substantial stone church construction, beginning 11th century, with structures demonstrating sophisticated architectural understanding, significant resource commitment, and deliberate visual prominence, establishing Christian institutional presence, visibly altering landscape previously dominated by wooden structures, including traditional pagan temples and halls. These stone churches represented multiple transformative elements simultaneously: technological development bringing sophisticated masonry techniques to previously predominantly wooden architectural tradition, economic statement demonstrating substantial resource mobilization capability, supporting non-productive religious structures. Political alignment, visibly associating Norse rulers with Christian institutional development through patronage relationships. And cosmological reorientation, physically establishing worship spaces dedicated to new religious system rather than traditional spiritual framework. The resulting built environment transformation created everyday visual experience, constantly reinforcing Norse society's revolutionary reorientation as people encountered these stone structures representing completely different architectural, religious, and political paradigm than traditional built forms characterizing earlier pagan Viking society. Dress and personal adornment evolve, reflecting both practical adaptations to changing social expectations and symbolic communication, indicating new identity alignments within transforming Norse world. Archaeological evidence demonstrates this evolution through changing jewelry styles, religious symbols shifting from pagan references toward Christian imagery, fastening methods adapting to new clothing types, decorative elements increasingly showing continental influences rather than distinctive Norse patterns. Textile remains similarly reveal changing clothing styles, increasingly aligned with broader European fashion currents, rather than maintaining entirely distinctive Norse traditions, particularly among elite groups seeking visual association with continental prestige models. Contemporary artistic representations confirm these changes, with carved figures, manuscript illustrations, and other depictions showing Norse individuals increasingly dressed similarly to other European populations, rather than maintaining entirely distinctive appearance, visibly marking them as separate cultural tradition. These costume changes represented identity transformation's material dimension, as individuals literally wrapped themselves in visual elements, communicating association with broader European cultural sphere, rather than exclusively Norse tradition, creating immediate visual impact whenever people encountered one another, while simultaneously reinforcing internal identity alignment through constant bodily experience wearing these transformed garments. Domestic architecture increasingly reflected social stratification through more pronounced differentiation between elite and common housing than characterized earlier Norse periods, when even chieftains occupied structures differing more in scale than fundamental type from ordinary farmers' dwellings. Archaeological evidence reveals emerging manor houses, urban elite residences, and royal complexes demonstrating architectural elaboration, spatial segregation, and material quality, creating built environment, physically embodying increasingly hierarchical social structure, rather than relatively egalitarian arrangements characterizing earlier Viking society. Construction techniques similarly evolved, with stone foundations, specialized outbuildings, and planned compounds replacing simpler structures characterizing earlier periods, particularly in southern Scandinavian regions, more directly engaged with continental influences. These architectural developments created living environment, physically reinforcing emerging social distinctions through spatial arrangements, literally placing people in different positions relative to one another, based on status considerations increasingly formalized within evolving Norse social structure, moving toward medieval European models, rather than maintaining traditional, more fluid arrangements characterizing earlier Viking society. Craft production demonstrates increasing specialization, standardization, and quality control, as production organization shifts from household-based manufacturing toward workshop systems, creating more sophisticated output through specialized labor and improved techniques. Archaeological evidence demonstrates this evolution through production waste deposits, tool assemblages, and finished products collectively indicating increased specialization compared to earlier, more generalized approaches. Metalworking particularly shows this development, with specialized workshops producing items demonstrating consistent quality standards, rather than highly variable output characteristic of individual craftspeople working independently. Ceramic production, similarly, evolves toward more standardized forms, decorative patterns, and technical quality, indicating specialized pottery production rather than household-level manufacturing. These craft developments created material environment filled with increasingly sophisticated objects, demonstrating growing economic complexity within Norse societies as they integrated more thoroughly with broader European production landscapes, where specialized manufacturing had longer established tradition than in northern regions previously characterized by more generalized household production meeting most daily needs locally rather than through specialized exchange networks. By century's end, Norse material world had transformed fundamentally, creating everyday environment visibly different from conditions characterizing Viking Age's beginning. People dressed differently, worshipped in different structures, used different exchange media, lived in different settlement types, and encountered different objects throughout daily activities than their ancestors had century earlier. This material transformation physically embodied broader cultural, political, and social changes reshaping Norse societies during Viking Age's final phase, creating tangible dimension of historical transition immediately evident to contemporary individuals through objects they handled, spaces they inhabited, and visual elements they encountered throughout ordinary activities. Understanding this material dimension reveals Viking Age's conclusion not merely as abstract historical process, but lived reality where people physically experience transformative changes through altered material surroundings, constantly reinforcing and enabling broader societal evolution through objects' practical functions and symbolic communications, operating simultaneously throughout daily existence within rapidly evolving Norse world. While Norse political presence had become increasingly normalized throughout much of Northern Europe, during Viking Age's final century, England experienced dramatic reversal, as Anglo-Saxon resurgence temporarily displaced Scandinavian influence before final Norse-descended intervention permanently transformed Ireland's political landscape. This English theatre represented Viking Age's final act, with complex interactions between Anglo-Saxon and Norse interests playing out through combination of military confrontation, political maneuvering, and cultural negotiation, creating historically pivotal sequences culminating in Norman conquest, fundamentally reshaping English development for centuries afterward. Understanding these English developments reveals Viking Age's conclusion from perspective, where Norse influence appeared simultaneously in retreat and ultimate triumph through historically ironic sequences representing period's complex final expressions. Renewed English resistance under Edward the Confessor gradually displaced Scandinavian political dominance, established during CNUT'S reign, through calculated policy simultaneously reducing Norse influence while maintaining sufficient diplomatic connection, preventing outright confrontation. Documentary sources describe Edward's systematic replacement of Scandinavian officials with Norman and English administrators, reduction of Danish housecarls, professional soldiers within royal military establishment, and cultural reorientation toward Norman, rather than Scandinavian connections, through patronage decisions favoring continental rather than northern relationships. Archaeological evidence similarly demonstrates declining Scandinavian material culture prominence during Edward's reign, with elite contexts increasingly showing Norman-influenced rather than Norse styles in architecture, decorative arts, and personal adornment. This Anglo-Saxon resurgence represented deliberate policy rather than accidental development, as Edward utilized his English royal position, systematically reducing Norse influence that had dominated English political landscape, during previous generation under Canute and his sons. The resulting political environment created conditions where Scandinavian interests remained present but increasingly marginalized within English power structures, predominantly oriented towards southern rather than northern European connections. Despite continuing Norse population presence throughout many English regions, established during earlier settlement phases, Viking influence remains strong in English politics despite Edward's policies, with significant Scandinavian-descended population, economic connections, and cultural elements creating complex environment where Norse presence continued despite official policy reducing its prominence. Archaeological evidence demonstrates continuing Scandinavian cultural elements throughout many English regions. Place names, legal customs, architectural features, agricultural practices, indicating lasting Norse influence beyond merely political dominance during Cnut's reign. Northern and Eastern England particularly maintained strong Scandinavian connections through settlement patterns established during earlier Danelaw period, creating regions where Norse cultural elements had thoroughly integrated with Anglo-Saxon traditions rather than remaining separate impositions easily removed through political decisions. These continuing Norse elements within English society created situation where Scandinavian interests remained relevant despite Edward's policies, maintaining connections potentially activated during appropriate circumstances, despite temporary eclipse during his reign, focusing relationships southward toward Normandy rather than northward toward Scandinavia. The resulting political environment contained latent Norse dimension, temporarily suppressed rather than permanently eliminated, creating conditions where appropriate catalyst might potentially reactivate Scandinavian connections, despite Anglo-Saxon royal policies attempting reorientation toward different European relationships. Harald Hardrada's ambitions to reclaim England represented final classic Viking expedition, with Norwegian king assembling substantial force pursuing territorial conquest through traditional Norse approach, combining maritime mobility, military pressure, and political opportunity exploitation. Documentary sources describe Harald's substantial credentials supporting this ambitious venture. Successful Byzantine military service establishing fearsome reputation, consolidation of Norwegian royal authority, demonstrating political capability, and claimed inheritance rights to English throne through agreement with previous Danish king, creating legitimacy framework beyond merely opportunistic raid. The expedition itself followed classic Viking operational pattern. Substantial fleet delivering significant force directly to vulnerable location, initial victories establishing operational presence, and political maneuvering attempting to convert military advantage into lasting territorial control. This Norwegian intervention represented Viking expansion's final classic expression, with traditional Norse approach, seaborne force pursuing territorial acquisition through combined military and political means, appearing one last time in historical record before fundamentally different patterns would characterize subsequent Northern European political developments. The resulting campaign created historically pivotal moment where traditional Viking methods confronted evolved English defensive capabilities, developed specifically countering such approaches through bitter experience facing similar threats during previous generations. Battle of Stamford Bridge, 1066, ends Viking military threat through decisive English victory, demonstrating how thoroughly European defensive capabilities had evolved, countering previously successful Norse operational methods. Documentary sources describe Harold Godwinson's remarkable achievement, rapidly moving substantial force northward from southern England, surprising Norwegian army unprepared for such swift response capability, and achieving decisive victory killing Harald Hardrada alongside majority of his force. Archaeological evidence confirms battle's basic historical outline, while providing additional details regarding equipment, tactical arrangements, and battlefield topography, shaping this historically decisive encounter. The English victory demonstrated how completely defensive adaptations had nullified traditional Viking advantages. Surprise negated through intelligence networks providing early warning, mobility countered through rapid response capabilities, and Norse martial prowess matched by disciplined English forces equally skilled in shield wall tactics and formation fighting. This battle effectively closed Viking Age's military dimension, demonstrating conclusively that traditional Norse advantages had disappeared. As European societies developed specific countermeasures addressing previously successful operational methods, the Norwegian expedition's comprehensive defeat marked historical endpoint, after which traditional Viking approaches no longer offered realistic opportunity for successful territorial acquisition, as defensive adaptations had effectively closed strategic window, previously allowing Norse expansion through distinctive operational methodology that had revolutionized European security calculations during earlier centuries. The death of the last great Viking king marks era's end symbolically and practically, with Harald Hardrada's fall at Stamford Bridge representing final appearance of Norse monarchy, pursuing territorial acquisition through traditional Viking methodologies rather than conventional medieval political approaches. Harald's remarkable career encapsulated Viking Age's entire developmental arc, beginning with traditional raiding and mercenary service establishing initial resource base, continued through Eastern service bringing Byzantine influences and substantial wealth accumulation, and culminated in conventional kingship, ultimately pursuing territorial expansion through methods combining traditional Norse and evolved medieval elements. His defeat and death symbolically closed historical chapter where Norse expansion had reshaped Northern European development through distinctive operational methodology, differentiating Viking activities from conventional medieval warfare. The Norwegian king's fall represented both personal tragedy and historical transition point, as individual leadership capabilities could no longer overcome systematic defensive adaptations, specifically designed countering traditional Norse advantages that had previously allowed spectacular success despite limited numerical resources. After Stamford Bridge, Norse territorial ambitions would necessarily express themselves through conventional medieval mechanisms, rather than distinctive Viking approaches that had characterized northern expansion throughout previous centuries, before finally meeting conclusive defeat on Yorkshire Field, where traditional Norse methods confronted specifically designed countermeasures, rendering them obsolete within evolved European military environment. The remarkable year 1066 witnessed historical pivot point where multiple historical currents, including Viking Age's final expressions, converged, creating fundamental transformation, reshaping Northern European development for centuries afterward. This pivotal period featured three-way struggle for England's throne, where Anglo-Saxon, Norwegian, and Norman claimants represented different developmental possibilities, reflecting various potential futures emerging from complex historical processes unfolding throughout previous centuries. Understanding this extraordinary historical convergence reveals Viking Age's conclusion not as simple ending, but transformation, where Norse influence simultaneously faced decisive military defeat while achieving ultimate political triumph through historically ironic sequence, representing period's complex legacy within European developmental patterns. Three-way struggle for England's throne created extraordinary historical convergence where different developmental trajectories competed for dominance through combination of military confrontation, political legitimacy claims, and diplomatic maneuvering, determining England's future orientation. Harold Godwinson represented Anglo-Saxon tradition, his rule continuing Edward the Confessor's policies, emphasizing English identity while maintaining connections with continental European powers through diplomatic rather than dynastic relationships. Harald Hardrada embodied traditional Viking approach, his Norwegian expedition attempting re-establishing direct Scandinavian control through combined military pressure and legitimacy claims based on previous agreements between Norse monarchs. William of Normandy offered third alternative combining Norse-descended leadership with thoroughly continental political, military, and cultural orientation, his invasion representing novel synthesis rather than continuation of either purely Anglo-Saxon or traditionally Viking models. This three-way competition created genuinely open historical moment where England's future orientation toward indigenous development, Scandinavian connection, or continental integration remained undetermined pending military outcomes and political developments unfolding throughout this pivotal year. The resulting historical sequence determined not merely immediate political leadership, but fundamental trajectory shaping English development throughout subsequent centuries, making 1066 genuine historical fulcrum, where multiple possible futures competed for realization through events compressed within remarkably brief timeframe. William of Normandy, Viking descendant, invades representing Norse expansion's final evolutionary expression, where Viking energy found manifestation through completely transformed political, military, and cultural forms, bearing little superficial resemblance to traditional Norse patterns, while maintaining certain fundamental characteristics, reshaping European development. Though culturally, linguistically, and politically, French, after several generations following Norse settlement, Norman society maintained distinctive characteristics reflecting Viking origins: extraordinary martial emphasis, dynamic expansionary energy, pragmatic adaptability, and ambitious leadership transcending conventional limitations. William's invasion embodied these characteristics through operations demonstrating ambition, organizational capability, and tactical sophistication reminiscent of Viking expeditions, while utilizing completely transformed methods: heavy cavalry rather than infantry, siege capabilities, specialized military engineering, replacing traditional Norse approaches with contemporary medieval military technologies. This Norman intervention represented Viking influence's final evolutionary form, where northern expansionary energy had thoroughly integrated with continental European political, cultural, and military forms, creating distinctive synthesis, transcending both original components while maintaining certain fundamental characteristics, reshaping European developmental possibilities through dynamic intervention rather than merely gradual evolution. The resulting historical impact demonstrated how thoroughly Viking energy had transformed European patterns even after traditional Norse forms had become obsolete within evolved medieval environment. Battle of Hastings transforms English history through Norman victory, establishing new dynasty, importing continental administrative systems, and creating ruling elite thoroughly integrated with broader European feudal structures, rather than maintaining either Anglo-Saxon insularity or traditional Scandinavian connections. Archaeological evidence confirms battle's basic historical outline, while providing additional details regarding equipment, tactical arrangements, and field topography, shaping this historically decisive encounter. Documentary sources describe William's combined arms approach, integrating infantry, archers, and decisive cavalry elements, overcoming Harold's defensive position through sophisticated tactical implementation rather than merely numerical advantage. The English defeat resulted partially from extraordinary circumstances: army exhaustion following forced march returning from Stamford Bridge, leadership losses during Norwegian campaign, and tactical disadvantages facing Norman combined arms approach, creating historical irony where successful defense against traditional Viking threat immediately preceded catastrophic defeat by Norse-descended force, utilizing completely transformed military methodology. This Norman victory established entirely new historical trajectory, where England became thoroughly integrated within continental European political, cultural, and military systems, rather than maintaining either traditional Anglo-Saxon arrangements or potential Scandinavian connections Harald Hardrada's success might have established. The resulting transformation fundamentally reoriented English development, creating ruling structure, legal system, linguistic environment, and political relationships reshaping Ireland's historical trajectory for centuries afterward, through sudden imposition rather than gradual evolution. End of the Anglo-Saxon era and beginning of medieval England marked decisive transition, where Viking Age's complex influences reached final expression through paradoxical sequence, where Norse power simultaneously experienced decisive defeat and ultimate triumph through different manifestations within compressed historical timeframe. Harold Godwinson's victory over Harald Hardrada at Stamford Bridge demonstrated conclusively that traditional Viking military approaches had become obsolete within evolved European defensive environment, closing historical chapter where Norse expansion had utilized distinctive operational methodology, successfully reshaping northern territories through tactics other European powers had initially found unanswerable before developing specific countermeasures. Conversely, William's victory at Hastings represented thoroughly transformed Norse influence's ultimate triumph, as Viking-descended leadership, utilizing completely evolved methodology, successfully established control over England, despite bearing little superficial resemblance to traditional Norse patterns, while maintaining certain fundamental characteristics: expansionary energy, martial emphasis, pragmatic adaptability, reshaping European development through dynamic intervention. This historical irony, where traditional Viking approach met decisive defeat, while fundamentally transformed Norse influence achieved ultimate success, perfectly captured Viking Age's complex conclusion, as Norse impact simultaneously ended in traditional form while achieving unprecedented influence through thoroughly transformed manifestation, representing period's complex legacy within European developmental patterns. The Norman conquest represents the last Viking conquest only through sophisticated historical understanding, recognizing transformed Norse influences' continued operation, despite dramatic cultural, linguistic, and methodological changes separating Normans from their Scandinavian ancestors. No contemporary observer would have identified William's invasion as Viking operation, given Norman forces' thoroughly French cultural identity, feudal political organization, and continental military methodology, starkly contrasting with traditional Norse approaches. Nevertheless, historical analysis reveals genuine continuity beneath superficial differences, as Norman expansionary energy, extraordinary martial emphasis, pragmatic adaptability, and ambitious leadership transcending conventional limitations, maintained certain fundamental characteristics, reshaping European development through dynamic intervention rather than merely gradual evolution. This sophisticated understanding reveals Viking Age's complex conclusion, not as simple ending, but transformation, where Norse influence continued reshaping European development through fundamentally altered forms, maintaining certain essential characteristics while adapting completely to evolved medieval environment where traditional Viking approaches had become obsolete. The resulting historical impact demonstrates how thoroughly Norse energy had transformed European patterns, even after traditional forms had disappeared, creating lasting legacy extending far beyond Viking Age's conventional historical boundaries through transformed manifestations, continuing shaping European development throughout medieval period and beyond. While dramatic events in England commanded contemporary attention, equally significant developments unfolded throughout northern territories. As Viking Age concluded through complex transitions affecting Norse heartlands and colonial territories. These northern developments, involving climate deterioration, political reorganization, religious transformation, and cultural evolution, gradually reshaped Scandinavian societies, concluding distinctive historical phase that had transformed Northern European development through unprecedented expansion, before eventually giving way to medieval patterns increasingly resembling broader continental arrangements. Understanding these northern transitions reveals Viking Age's conclusion from perspective, where distinctive Norse cultural forms gradually faded rather than suddenly disappearing, creating complex evolutionary process, transforming Viking societies toward medieval European patterns through gradual adaptation rather than sudden replacement. Greenland colony struggles with cooling climate, creating increasingly challenging conditions for marginally viable settlement established during more favorable medieval warm period. Scientific evidence, including ice cores, pollen samples, and archaeological materials, demonstrates progressive environmental deterioration, creating shorter growing seasons, increased sea ice limiting maritime connections, and reduced agricultural productivity, undermining settlements' economic foundation. Contemporary documentary sources similarly reference increasing challenges maintaining viable community, with supply voyages becoming increasingly irregular, while available resources diminished through environmental constraints beyond human control. Archaeological evidence reveals adaptation attempts, architectural modifications, improving insulation, dietary shifts, emphasizing marine resources over declining agricultural products, tool innovations addressing changing resource availability, demonstrating Norse pragmatic problem-solving capacities, even while facing existential challenges threatening entire colonial venture. These environmental pressures created fundamental challenges questioning long-term viability for remotest Norse colonial territory, foreshadowing eventual abandonment during subsequent centuries as climate continued deteriorating beyond threshold, permitting sustainable Norse settlement, maintaining traditional cultural patterns within increasingly hostile Arctic environment. This Greenland situation exemplified broader pattern, where Norse colonial territories faced specific challenges during Viking Age's conclusion, with varying outcomes ranging from successful adaptation toward long-term viability through transformed arrangements to eventual abandonment when conditions exceeded adaptation capabilities within available technological and social frameworks. Iceland submits to Norwegian rule, ending independence through political arrangement, reflecting broader consolidation trends, reshaping Norse world during period. Documentary sources describe this transition occurring without military conquest, as Icelandic leaders formally accepted Norwegian royal authority through agreement, responding both external pressure and internal developments, making traditional independence increasingly difficult, maintaining within evolved northern political environment. Archaeological and documentary evidence reveals Iceland facing multiple challenges during period: environmental pressures from early climate deterioration, internal social conflicts between competing chieftains, economic difficulties maintaining adequate external connections, religious transitions requiring institutional support beyond local resources. These combined pressures created situation where Norwegian connection offered potential advantages: conflict resolution mechanisms addressing internal disputes, commercial relationships ensuring critical supply maintenance, religious institutional support facilitating church establishment, political protection against potential threats, offsetting independence loss through practical benefits, addressing specific challenges facing isolated island society during transitional period. This Icelandic political evolution demonstrated broader pattern where previously independent Norse territories increasingly accepted integration within larger political structures during Viking Age's conclusion, as practical advantages increasingly outweighed traditional independence value. Within evolved Northern European environment, where smaller political entities faced mounting challenges, maintaining complete autonomy against larger consolidated kingdoms emerging throughout region. Christianity firmly established across Scandinavia, with institutional church presence, official royal support, and public religious practice transformation, creating fundamental reorientation despite continued traditional element persistence beneath official Christian surface. Archaeological evidence confirms this religious transformation through church construction, burial practice changes, and religious object distribution patterns, demonstrating Christianity's dominant position by centuries' end, despite continued traditional element traces appearing in remote areas or private contexts. Documentary sources similarly describe established church hierarchies, clerical education systems, and ecclesiastical property holdings, indicating institutional religion firmly established throughout Norse territories, rather than merely nominal royal conversion without substantial social penetration. This religious transformation represented fundamental cultural reorientation, as societies previously oriented around indigenous polytheistic frameworks increasingly organized themselves according to Christian cosmological understanding, ethical principles, and institutional structures. The resulting religious landscape featured thoroughly established institutional Christianity, officially dominating public religious expression, while probably maintaining significant syncretism in private practice, particularly regarding protective magic, agricultural rituals, and certain life transitions where traditional approaches maintained perceived efficacy alongside or beneath Christian alternatives. Old ways preserved only in isolated areas and practices, as mainstream Norse society increasingly resembled broader European patterns through religious transformation, political consolidation, and economic integration. Archaeological evidence demonstrates traditional cultural element persistence primarily in geographically remote regions. Lower social classes, less directly engaged with international connections, and specific practice domains where traditional approaches maintained practical utility beyond their original religious context. Certain craft traditions, maritime techniques, legal concepts, and social customs maintained distinctive Norse characteristics, even while broader cultural framework increasingly aligned with continental European patterns through systematic integration processes reshaping northern societies during period. This preservation pattern created situation where Viking Age's distinctive Norse culture gradually transformed rather than suddenly disappeared, with certain elements maintaining continuity through adaptation within changed contexts, while others faded through obsolescence when newer approaches offered advantages within evolved northern environment. The resulting cultural landscape featured increasingly European-oriented mainstream practices, occasionally incorporating distinctive Norse elements, rather than maintaining completely separate tradition, creating evolutionary rather than revolutionary transformation, gradually concluding Viking Age through assimilation rather than elimination of its distinctive cultural patterns. The saga writing era begins as living memory fades, creating literary tradition preserving Norse cultural heritage through written documentation, as oral transmission became increasingly unreliable, preserving detailed historical knowledge across multiple generations. Documentary evidence demonstrates systematic saga compilation, beginning during period, with Icelandic scholars particularly active collecting traditional narratives, historical accounts, and cultural knowledge previously transmitted exclusively through oral tradition. This literary development represented crucial cultural preservation mechanism, as Vikings' extraordinary accomplishments gained permanent recording rather than eventually disappearing through oral tradition's inevitable degradation across generations. The resulting literary corpus, family sagas, kings' sagas, legendary tales, mythological accounts, created exceptional historical resource preserving Norse perspective regarding their own remarkable historical experience while simultaneously transforming that experience through literary conventions, retrospective interpretation, and inevitable selection processes determining which elements received preservation while others disappeared through omission. This saga tradition represented Viking Age's complex conclusion, as Norse culture simultaneously ended in traditional form, while achieving unprecedented preservation through revolutionary literacy application, transforming oral cultural heritage into written literary tradition, substantially surviving into modern era, providing direct connection with Viking experience that would otherwise have largely disappeared from historical record, beyond external observers' limited accounts. Political consolidation throughout mainland Scandinavia continues processes described earlier, with royal authority increasingly centralized, while traditional local autonomy gradually diminished through systematic governance transformations. Archaeological evidence demonstrates this political evolution through changing settlement patterns, administrative facility distribution, tax collection evidence, and elite residence characteristics collectively indicating increasing hierarchical organization, rather than relatively egalitarian arrangements characterizing earlier Viking society. Documentary sources similarly describe expanded royal administration, territorial control systems, and governance hierarchies, extending central authority throughout previously fragmented territories through systematic institutional development rather than merely personal leadership networks characterizing earlier arrangements. This political transformation created increasingly formalized governance structures, resembling broader European monarchical patterns, rather than distinctive Norse arrangements characterizing earlier Viking Age, establishing institutional frameworks substantially outlasting individual rulers through bureaucratic continuity, rather than requiring continuous charismatic leadership, maintaining cohesion through personal capability. The resulting political landscape featured increasingly conventional European-style kingdoms, where royal authority operated through institutionalized channels, rather than distinctive Norse governance arrangements characterizing Viking Age's earlier phases, before systematic political evolution had gradually transformed northern political organization toward medieval patterns increasingly resembling continental models, despite maintaining certain distinctive characteristics reflecting specific Scandinavian historical development. International relations increasingly follow conventional medieval patterns rather than distinctive Viking interactions characterized by combination of raiding, trading, and selective settlement, establishing Norse presence throughout Northern Europe. Documentary evidence describes formalized diplomatic relationships, dynastic marriage alliances, commercial treaties, and political agreements indicating Scandinavian kingdoms had become normalized participants within European diplomatic system, rather than external forces interacting primarily through occasional violent intervention or opportunistic commercial engagement characterizing earlier Viking patterns. Archaeological evidence similarly demonstrates established trade relationships, cultural exchange patterns, and political connection indicators, showing systematic integration within European networks, rather than merely occasional interaction through raiding or trading expeditions. This international normalization represented fundamental transformation from Viking Age's distinctive interaction patterns, as Scandinavian societies increasingly engaged European neighbors through conventional medieval diplomatic frameworks, rather than distinctive Norse approaches, combining opportunistic raiding with pragmatic trading, creating unique interaction pattern dramatically different from standard European diplomatic relations. The resulting international environment featured Scandinavian kingdoms as regular participants within European political system, rather than external forces periodically intervening through disruptive expeditions, creating fundamental transition, concluding Viking Age's distinctive international dimension through normalization rather than continued exceptional patterns that had previously characterized Northern engagement with broader European world. By century's end, Norse world had transformed fundamentally, creating historical transition point reasonably identified as Viking Age's conclusion, despite significant continuity elements maintaining certain distinctive Northern characteristics within increasingly normalized European context. Traditional Viking activities, raiding expeditions, colonial ventures, distinctive trade-raid combinations had effectively ceased through combination of European defensive adaptations, making them increasingly unviable in internal Norse developments, creating alternative approaches better suited to evolved medieval environment. Political consolidation had established conventional kingdoms throughout most Norse territories, with centralized monarchies increasingly resembling broader European governance patterns, despite maintaining certain distinctive characteristics reflecting specific Scandinavian historical development. Religious transformation had firmly established institutional Christianity throughout Norse world, creating fundamental cultural reorientation despite continued traditional element persistence beneath official Christian surface. The resulting Northern European landscape featured increasingly normalized Scandinavian societies, participating within broader medieval systems through conventional mechanisms, rather than distinctive Viking approaches that had previously created revolutionary disruption, before gradually fading through evolutionary processes, transforming Norse societies, concluding extraordinary historical chapter where Northern expansion had fundamentally reshaped European development, before eventually giving way to medieval patterns increasingly resembling continental arrangements through gradual adaptation rather than sudden replacement.